the 15th of September, 1945. Imagine this. Dawn is minutes away. A pale gray light leaks over a shattered hillside on a remote Pacific island. Inside a ruined storage hut, a group of Japanese women, starving, shaken, sit in complete silence. Their wrists aren't chained, but fear holds them tighter than any rope ever could. They've spent the entire night whispering prayers, clutching rosaries, clutching each other, preparing themselves for what they believe will happen the moment the sun fully rises. Execution. For months, their commanders drilled the same warning into their minds. Americans will not spare you. Better to die with honor than fall into their hands. Better to choose the blade than humiliation. Propaganda had shown them monstrous images. Americans dragging women away, laughing as they killed prisoners, stripping civilians of dignity. Every rumor made the next worse. Every whisper added another layer of terror. And now, after weeks of hiding without food, sickness spreading among children, they were finally found, surrounded, captured. The women believed it instantly. Morning will be our last breath. Some cried silently. Some held knives tucked inside their sleeves, not to fight, but to die before dishonor. One mother held her toddler so tightly he could barely breathe. Another woman, barely 20, recited her family's ancestral prayer over and over, until her voice cracked. An elderly woman named Hannah kept staring at the horizon, murmuring, "When the sun rises, they will come for us." The night wind slithered through the gaps in the walls, carrying the sounds of American boots, shovels, clanking gear. The women heard them preparing something outside, and assumed the worst. "Graves," whispered one. "Execution stakes," said another. No one argued, no one doubted, because why would the enemy spare them? When the horizon softened into gold, footsteps approached, heavy boots. Calm, slow, deliberate. The women locked arms, bracing for the door to slam open. A few squeezed their eyes shut. Some prepared their hidden blades. Children whimpered. The wooden door creaked. A tall U.S. Marine stepped inside, helmet shadowing his eyes. Behind him, two soldiers stood quietly, rifles lowered, not raised. The interpreter cleared his throat, voice steady, almost gentle. "Please, come outside. No harm." No one moved. They were sure this was a trick to drag them out for execution. The Marines stepped aside, creating space instead of closing in. Finally, trembling, Hannah stood. "We will go with honor," she whispered to the women. They followed her into the morning light, expecting to see rifles aimed at their hearts. But instead, there were no execution pits, no ropes, no firing line, just a table. No one stopped her, no one struck her, no one laughed. A little girl, barely 6, clutched her mother's kimono and whispered, "Is it safe?" The mother smiled weakly, unsure herself. Another woman, holding a baby, slowly reached for a piece of soft bread. When the child bit into it, the relief in her eyes was almost too much to bear. Small murmurs of astonishment began to ripple through the group. The enemy, the Americans, they had feared, were performing acts of mercy, not violence. Each bite of bread, each sip of tea, each careful step of the soldiers back from the women built a fragile bridge across the chasm of fear. Hours passed. Food was given. Blankets were distributed. Water refilled. Nothing else was demanded. The Marines did not watch them like predators. They gave space, maintained order, and offered care without intrusion. Mothers whispered to their daughters that this was not normal, that surely a cruel trap awaited. But day after day, the pattern continued. The women began to eat more confidently. Children laughed softly while playing on the dirt floor, and a fragile sense of trust took root. The women began to notice small gestures. An extra blanket for a shivering child. A bowl refilled when it ran empty. A gentle nod instead of a commanding shout. It was almost unbearable. They were not being punished. They were not being humiliated. The enemy was, in every action, showing restraint. One afternoon, a Marine brought a sack of hygiene supplies. Soap, brushes, cloths. A young mother hesitated, too ashamed to claim anything. But slowly, with trembling fingers, she reached for a brush and washed her child's face. The child laughed, a small, uncertain sound, but pure joy nonetheless. The women realized the Americans had not come to destroy them. They had come to ensure survival. And in that realization, disbelief slowly began to give way to gratitude. Though No one dared speak it aloud. The women also observed the children's resilience. Some played hide-and-seek, mimicking soldiers in their games, laughing despite the fear that still lingered in the air. Mothers clutched their daughters and sons, seeing them flourish under the care of the very soldiers they had been trained to fear. The paradox was nearly overwhelming. How could the same people who represented the enemy, the ones they had been told would commit atrocities, offer such humanity? Letters soon arrived from the Red Cross, allowing them to communicate with families in distant villages. They wrote cautiously at first, "We are alive. No harm has come to us. Food is given. Blankets are provided." Each word carried a weight. They had never imagined that the world beyond the island still existed, and that mercy could be real. This documentation of kindness shattered decades of fear, training, and propaganda. It would take weeks for the women to fully comprehend that survival could coexist with dignity, and that an enemy could be humane. By mid-morning, they no longer flinched at the presence of soldiers. They no longer feared the dawn. The enemy had not harmed them. They had eaten. They had been sheltered. They had been acknowledged as human beings, not objects to be discarded. The shock of mercy lingered long after the first breakfast, reshaping expectations and planting seeds of a different understanding, one that would endure far beyond the island of Saipan. Weeks turned into months, and the Japanese women on site slowly adjusted to the strange new reality. Survival paired with dignity. The mornings began predictably. Food was prepared and brought to them in neat lines, rice steaming, broth warm, fruit sliced. Every day, the Marines maintained distance, observing but never intruding. The women marveled at this consistency. It was almost painful to believe. Their bodies, once emaciated, regained strength, yet their minds remained on edge. Years of propaganda had drilled into them a singular truth. Surrender meant death. Captivity meant shame. Now, that truth had been shattered, replaced by another they could barely grasp. Mercy could exist in war. Fakiko, who had initially trembled at the sight of the first breakfast, began to help organize her fellow prisoners. She taught younger mothers how to safely tend to children while keeping them out of harm's way, how to share blankets and cups of tea without conflict. Leadership arose organically among the women. They were no longer merely survivors, but coordinators of their own small community. The soldiers noticed, nodding occasionally, acknowledging the self-organization without intruding. Every gesture of respect, every careful retreat of a rifle, reinforced that the Americans' intent was not domination, it was care. Children became a focal point of this fragile community. They laughed softly, whispered secrets, and began to mimic the movements of the Marines in play, their innocence slowly returning. Mothers watched, astonished at how quickly laughter could replace fear. There was a ritual in these small freedoms. Children received food first, blankets wrapped snugly around them, and water replenished regularly. The women realized that the enemy was, intentionally or not, teaching them that humanity could exist even in war. Occasionally, the Marines conducted medical inspections, always with the same restraint. Children with fevers were tended to carefully. Mothers with injuries or illness received treatment, never punishment or judgment. Each interaction, however small, reinforced the impossible truth. They were valued as human beings. Sachiko, who had whispered about praying for death over dishonor, began to understand that survival could be honorable. The paradox was almost too much. How could the enemy, once imagined as monstrous, act with kindness? The Red Cross visits became lifelines. Letters to and from family allowed the women to reassert connections to a world beyond captivity. They described conditions carefully. We are alive. We are fed. We have blankets. We are safe. These messages were extraordinary. For the first time, the women realized that they had agency even in captivity. Each day's survival was now not just about endurance, it was about observation, learning, and adaptation. These small routines emerged within the camp. Women organized sewing circles, teaching younger girls mending skills. Some shared stories of the past. Others whispered hopes for the future. The Americans observed quietly, acknowledging the activities with silence, allowing autonomy without intrusion. Each moment of independence built confidence, slowly replacing fear with cautious trust. By the end of the summer, the women could walk freely within the designated safe zones. Guards no longer hovered closely. They carried blankets, distributed meals, and respected privacy. The shock of mercy had evolved into comprehension. The women recognized that restraint, not violence, could shape a community, even amid chaos. For the first time, they felt they could endure captivity with their dignity intact, their humanity acknowledged, and their spirit quietly resilient. As the war drew closer to its end, the women on Saipan began to comprehend the full scope of what had happened. Months of fear, exhaustion, and isolation were met with something they had never expected: consistency, care, and respect from the very enemy they had been taught to hate. Each day brought small proofs that their lives were valued. Meals arrived punctually, children were tended to, blankets replaced, and medical care administered with skill and compassion. The Americans never overstepped, never humiliated. The boundaries established became a silent contract. Safety in exchange for trust, restraint in exchange for obedience. When the announcement of Japan's surrender finally reached the island, there was no triumphant celebration, only cautious relief. The women had endured far more than they could have imagined, and yet they were alive, untouched, and strangely empowered by the restraint shown to them. They had learned that mercy could coexist with conflict, that strength could be measured not by cruelty, but by the preservation of dignity. In the following weeks, the women were escorted to ships bound for Japan. They carried bundles of personal belongings, soap, cloth, and small tokens of survival. Many were still barefoot, their faces pale, their bodies thin, yet their spirits bore a newfound sense of humanity. Years later, the memories persisted. Sachiko and others would recount to their children and grandchildren the shocking reality that in the midst of wars, savagery, there were moments of unlooked-for compassion. It was not bombs or battles they remembered most, but the rare, transformative kindness of those who had every reason to be merciless. In a conflict defined by death and destruction, the greatest shock had been life, preserved with respect and humanity.